She smiled as she walked down that aisle, convinced she was marrying into everything she ever wanted. But in less than an hour, a boy she humiliated would reveal a truth so devastating it would shatter her entire world. And she had no idea what was coming. The ceremony was perfect. At least, that's what everyone kept saying. The Grand Riverside Hotel in downtown Charlotte was decorated with thousands of white roses. Crystal chandeliers caught the afternoon light just right. And Michelle Anderson stood at the center of it all, radiant in her custom Vera Wang gown. She had spent 2 years planning this day. Every detail, every moment, every photograph was calculated to project one thing: success. Michelle wasn't just marrying Richard Bennett. She was marrying into the Bennett family. Old money, real estate empire, country club memberships, the works. This was her arrival, her validation. The girl from the middle-class suburb who'd clawed her way up through sheer ambition and strategic networking was finally getting everything she deserved. But standing near the back entrance, barely noticed by anyone, was a 17-year-old boy in a borrowed blazer that didn't quite fit. His name was Daniel. He held a small envelope in his trembling hands, and what he carried inside would change everything. But before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Michelle Anderson grew up watching her mother work 2 jobs just to keep their small apartment in the suburbs. She remembered the whispers at school when she showed up in thrift store clothes, the way wealthier kids looked past her like she was invisible. She swore she'd never be invisible again. In college, she studied communications but majored in networking. She learned how to dress, how to talk, which events to attend, which people to befriend. By 25, she was working in marketing for a luxury real estate firm, attending charity galas, dating men with family names that opened doors. That's where she met Richard. He was handsome, charming, and came from exactly the kind of family she needed. Richard Bennett was the only son of Marcus Bennett, a commercial real estate developer who owned half the skyline in Charlotte. Richard was kind, maybe a little naive, but Michelle saw potential. She molded herself into exactly what his family would approve of: polished, gracious, ambitious, but not too ambitious. His mother adored her. His father respected her drive. And Richard loved her completely. But Michelle didn't love him. Not really. She loved what he represented. She loved the life he could give her, and she was willing to do whatever it took to protect that life. So when she saw that boy, Daniel, standing awkwardly near the gift table in clothes that clearly didn't belong, something inside her bristled. He didn't fit. He was a stain on her perfect day, and Michelle Anderson did not tolerate imperfection. Daniel Foster didn't want to be at that wedding. He almost didn't come. For weeks, he'd stared at the invitation that arrived in the mail, crisp, ivory cardstock with elegant script announcing the marriage of Richard James Bennett and Michelle Rose Anderson. He didn't know Michelle. He barely remembered Richard. But 17 years ago, Richard had been married before to Daniel's mother, Sarah. Daniel was born during that brief marriage, a marriage that fell apart when he was only 6 months old. Sarah was young, 21, working as a waitress when she met Richard, who was 23 and still figuring out his life. They got married too fast, fought too much, and when the divorce came, it was bitter. Richard's family wanted nothing to do with Sarah or the baby. Richard himself, under pressure from his father, signed away his parental rights in exchange for Sarah dropping any financial claims. Marcus Bennett made it very clear. Sarah and her son were not part of their world. Sarah moved to a different state, to a small town in Tennessee, and raised Daniel on her own. She worked at a diner, lived in a 2-bedroom apartment, and never once spoke badly about Richard. She told Daniel his father was young and scared, that people make mistakes, that maybe one day they'd reconnect. Daniel grew up quiet, thoughtful, a little lonely. He worked hard in school, helped his mom with bills, and tried not to think too much about the father who chose to forget he existed. Then, 6 months ago, Sarah got sick. Cancer, stage 4, too advanced for treatment. She had weeks, maybe a month. In those final days, lying in a hospice bed, she told Daniel the truth about his father. She told him about the Bennett family, about the money, about the legal documents she'd signed. And she told him about the letter she wrote years ago that she never sent. A letter to Richard, explaining everything, asking for nothing, just wanting him to know that Daniel existed and was loved. Sarah died holding Daniel's hand, and Daniel, now alone in the world, living with a distant aunt who barely had room for him, found that letter in his mother's things. He also found the wedding invitation that had come to their old address, forwarded by the post office. And he made a decision. He would go. Not to cause trouble, not to ask for anything, just to see his father one more time, to stand in the same room, to maybe, just maybe, find the courage to say something. Daniel arrived at the Grand Riverside Hotel just as guests were being seated for the ceremony. He slipped in through a side entrance, clutching the letter and a small photograph of his mother. His blazer, borrowed from a friend, was too big in the shoulders. His shoes were scuffed. He looked exactly like what he was, a kid who didn't belong. Michelle noticed him immediately. She was standing near the bridal suite entrance, doing a final check of her makeup when she saw him lingering by the guest book. Something about him irritated her instantly. Maybe it was the cheap clothes. Maybe it was the nervous way he kept glancing around like he was afraid of being caught. Maybe it was just that today was supposed to be perfect, and he was a visual reminder that not everyone lived in her world. She walked over to her maid of honor, Jessica, and whispered, "Who is that?" Jessica glanced over and shrugged. "No idea. Maybe someone's nephew?" Michelle frowned. "He looks homeless." She said it just loud enough for the two bridesmaids nearby to hear. They giggled. Michelle felt a flush of satisfaction. Small cruelties felt good sometimes, especially when you were nervous. And despite all her planning, Michelle was nervous. This day had to go perfectly. Everything depended on it. Daniel, meanwhile, had found a seat in the very back row. He didn't plan to stay long, just watch the ceremony, maybe catch a glimpse of Richard, and leave. No one needed to know who he was. But then Michelle walked past him on her way to the bridal suite, and their eyes met for just a second. She looked at him with such open disdain that Daniel felt his face burn. He looked down at his hands. He should leave. This was a mistake. But something kept him in that seat. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was grief. Or maybe it was just the faint, desperate hope that his father might recognize him. The ceremony began. The music swelled. Michelle walked down the aisle on her father's arm, beaming, glowing, absolutely triumphant. Richard stood at the altar, looking genuinely happy. He was a good man. People always said that about him. Maybe a little passive, maybe too willing to follow his father's lead, but fundamentally kind. The vows were exchanged, the rings were placed, the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and the room erupted in applause. Michelle kissed Richard and felt the weight of victory settle over her. She'd done it. This was her life now. The Bennett name, the money, the security. As they walked back down the aisle together, Michelle scanned the crowd, soaking in the admiration. And then she saw him again. Daniel, still sitting in the back, watching with an expression she couldn't quite read. And something inside her snapped. Maybe it was the adrenaline. Maybe it was the champagne she'd had before the ceremony to calm her nerves. But Michelle leaned into Richard and whispered, loud enough for the people nearby to hear, "Do you see that boy in the back, the one in the terrible jacket?" Richard glanced over, confused. "Who?" "I don't know, but he's been lurking around all day. He looks like he wandered in off the street. Should we have security check on him?" A few guests turned to look. Daniel felt their stares. His face flushed. Richard frowned. "Michelle, come on, it's fine." But Michelle had already gestured to one of the ushers. "Can you make sure he's actually supposed to be here? He doesn't look like he belongs." The usher, uncomfortable but obedient, started walking toward Daniel. And that's when Daniel stood up. His heart was pounding, his hands were shaking, but he pulled the envelope from his pocket, the one with the letter and the photograph, and he walked toward the front of the room. The crowd went silent. Michelle's smile faltered. Richard's expression shifted from confusion to something else, something like recognition. Daniel stopped about 10 feet from the altar. He looked at Richard. Just Richard. "I'm sorry," Daniel said quietly. His voice barely carried, but in the silence, everyone heard him. "I didn't come here to ruin anything. I needed you to know. My mom passed away 6 months ago. Her name was Sarah Foster. You were married to her a long time ago." Richard went pale. Michelle's eyes widened. The room seemed to tilt. Daniel held out the envelope. "She wrote you this letter years ago. She never sent it, but I thought you should have it." Richard took a step forward, then stopped. His father, Marcus Bennett, stood up from his seat in the front row. Richard, don't. But Richard wasn't listening. He took the envelope from Daniel's hand. He opened it. Inside was the letter, written in his ex-wife's handwriting, and a photograph of a baby. On the back, in faded ink, it read, Daniel James Foster, born March 15th, 2008, your son. Richard stared at the photo, then at Daniel. The resemblance was there, undeniable, in the shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw. Richard's voice broke, you're my son. Michelle felt the floor drop out from under her. What? Richard looked at her, then back at Daniel, then at his father, who was now standing rigid with fury. You knew, Richard said to Marcus. You knew he existed and you never told me. Marcus's voice was ice. We handled it. She signed papers. This is not your problem. He's my son. Richard's voice cracked with emotion. The room was absolutely silent. Guests stared frozen, unsure whether to leave or stay. Michelle felt panic rising in her chest. This couldn't be happening. Not today. Not now. But Daniel wasn't finished. I don't want anything from you, he said, his voice stronger now. I didn't come here for money or anything like that. My mom just wanted you to know I existed. That's all. I just wanted to meet you once. And then he turned to Michelle. I'm sorry I ruined your wedding. I really am. Michelle opened her mouth, but no words came out. Because in that moment, looking at this boy, this child her husband had abandoned, she realized something horrible. She had spent years crafting her image, her status, her perfect life, and she had done it by stepping on people, by dismissing them, by deciding who mattered and who didn't. And this boy, this kind, broken, grieving boy, had more dignity in his worn-out shoes than she had in her entire designer wardrobe. Richard did something then that no one expected. He crossed the space between them and pulled Daniel into a hug. Daniel stiffened, then slowly, hesitantly, hugged him back. And he started to cry. Not loud, wrenching sobs, but quiet tears that he'd been holding in for months, maybe years. Richard cried too. I'm so sorry, Richard whispered. I'm so sorry. Michelle stood there, her perfect dress, her perfect hair, her perfect day crumbling around her. Guests began to murmur. Some got up to leave. Others pulled out their phones. Marcus Bennett stormed out of the room, his face a mask of rage. Jessica, the maid of honor, touched Michelle's arm. Maybe we should, but Michelle shook her off. She walked up to Richard and Daniel, her voice shaking. Richard, we need to talk, now. Richard pulled back from Daniel, but kept a hand on his shoulder. Not now, Michelle. This is our wedding day. I know, and I just found out I have a son I didn't know about, a son my father kept from me. His voice was hard now, harder than she'd ever heard it. Do you understand what that means? Michelle's voice dropped to a desperate whisper. This changes everything. Yes, Richard said quietly. It does. He turned to Daniel. Do you have a place to stay? Daniel nodded. I'm with my aunt, in Tennessee. I want you to stay, here in Charlotte, with me. We have a lot to talk about, a lot to figure out, but I want to know you, if you'll let me. Daniel looked at him, this stranger who was his father, and slowly nodded. Richard looked at Michelle. I need to take... Richard and Michelle's marriage was annulled 3 months after the wedding. Richard's lawyers argued that the marriage was entered under false pretenses, and given that it was never consummated due to the immediate separation after the ceremony, the annulment was granted quickly. Michelle moved out of the Bennett family home and back into a modest apartment. She lost her job at the real estate firm, not officially because of the scandal, but everyone knew. Her social circle evaporated overnight. Turns out, people who befriend you for status disappear when the status does. Richard, meanwhile, spent those months getting to know Daniel. They went to baseball games, had awkward dinners, talked late into the night about Sarah, about regrets, about second chances. Daniel enrolled in a private school in Charlotte, funded by Richard. He was quiet, still grieving his mother, but slowly, carefully, he began to trust his father. Marcus Bennett refused to acknowledge Daniel at first, but Richard didn't back down. "He's my son. You kept him from me for 17 years. I won't lose another day." Eventually, grudgingly, Marcus relented. Not because he wanted to, but because he realized Richard was serious about cutting ties if he had to choose. One evening, 6 months after the wedding that never was, Richard invited Daniel to dinner at a small Italian restaurant downtown. It was just the two of them. "I've been thinking a lot about your mom," Richard said, twirling pasta on his fork. "About the choices I made back then. I was scared, weak. I let my father control everything." Daniel nodded. "She never blamed you. She said you were young." "That's not an excuse." Richard set down his fork. "I should have fought for you. I should have been braver. I can't change the past, but I can try to be better now. If you'll let me." Daniel looked at him. "I'd like that." They ate in comfortable silence for a while. Then Daniel asked, "Do you ever hear from her, Michelle?" Richard sighed. "No. I think about reaching out sometimes, to apologize, to explain, but I don't think she wants to hear from me." Daniel considered this. She seemed really angry that day. She was humiliated. Her whole world fell apart. Richard paused. "But you know what? I think maybe that needed to happen, for both of us." Michelle spent those 6 months alone, really alone. No parties, no networking events, no carefully curated Instagram posts. Just her, a small apartment, and a lot of uncomfortable silence. At first, she was angry. Angry at Richard for abandoning her. Angry at Daniel for showing up. Angry at the universe for destroying everything she'd worked for. But slowly, painfully, the anger gave way to something else. Shame. She'd humiliated a grieving teenager at what should have been the happiest day of her life. She'd married a man she didn't really love for reasons that now seemed hollow and pathetic. She'd spent years building a life that was beautiful on the outside and empty on the inside. One afternoon, she found herself in a small coffee shop in a neighborhood she used to avoid. Too working class, not the right image. She was sitting by the window when she saw a woman struggling with a stroller and grocery bags. Without thinking, Michelle got up and held the door open. The woman smiled. "Thank you so much. You're a lifesaver." It was such a small thing, but it felt real. More real than anything Michelle had felt in years. She started volunteering at a woman's shelter,
helping women who were trying to rebuild their lives after divorce or abuse. She stopped worrying about designer labels and started worrying about whether she was actually helping anyone. And she started seeing a therapist. I spent my whole life trying to be someone I thought people would admire, she told her therapist one day. But I don't think I ever figured out who I actually am. So, who do you want to be? Michelle thought about that for a long time. Someone kind, someone real, someone who doesn't need to prove anything. It was a start. One day, almost a year after the wedding, Michelle saw Richard and Daniel at a park. They were throwing a football, laughing. She almost walked away, but something stopped her. She approached slowly. "Hi." Richard turned, surprised. "Michelle." They stared at each other for a moment. Then Michelle turned to Daniel. "I owe you an apology. What I said that day, the way I treated you, it was cruel and wrong. You didn't deserve that. I'm truly sorry." Daniel looked at her carefully. Then he nodded. "Thank you." Michelle looked at Richard. "I'm sorry to you too. For everything." Richard's expression softened. "I hope you're doing okay." "I'm trying." She smiled a little. Turns out, losing everything can be the best thing that ever happens to you. Richard smiled back. "Yeah, I know what you mean."
The story of that wedding spread through Charlotte for months. Some people saw it as a scandal, others saw it as a tragedy. But for the people actually involved, it was something else. It was a reckoning. Richard and Daniel built a relationship that was real and hard-won. Marcus eventually came around, though he never quite forgave himself for the years he stole from his son. And Michelle, well, Michelle learned that the life you build on appearances will always collapse eventually. But the life you build on truth, on kindness, on actual connection, that's the one that lasts. Daniel graduated high school with honors. He got into college. He visited his mother's grave every month and told her about his life, his father, the second chance he never expected. And sometimes when he thinks back to that day, standing in that beautiful hotel in his borrowed jacket, he realizes something. His mother's letter didn't just reconnect him with his father, it freed everyone involved from the lies they were living. Because the truth, no matter how painful, is always better than a beautiful lie. And that's the lesson. Not that wealth is bad or ambition is wrong, but that if you build your life on a foundation of status and appearance, you'll spend every day terrified of losing it. But if you build it on truth, on love, on seeing people for who they really are, not what they can do for you, then even when everything falls apart, you'll still have something real to hold on to. Michelle learned that. Richard learned that. And Daniel, the boy who everyone overlooked, taught them all what it means to have quiet courage and unshakable dignity. So here's the question. What would you have done in Michelle's position? Could you have looked past your own ambition and seen the truth standing right in front of you? And what about Daniel? Would you have had the strength to walk into that room knowing you might be rejected all over again? Think about the people in your own life that you might have overlooked, the ones who don't fit your image of success or status. What might you be missing? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story made you feel something, if it made you think twice about the choices you're making in your own life, then subscribe, because we're just getting started. And trust me, the next story will hit even harder.